Welcome to Sustainability Bridges, a Eurosif podcast that aims to build bridges between policymakers, investors, academics and civil society around the theme of sustainable investment. Eurosif, the European Sustainable Investment Forum, is the leading pan-European association promoting sustainable finance and investment at the European level. In these podcasts, Eurosif's Executive Director invites distinguished guests for a 30-minute conversation on current events shaping the sustainable investment community.
Hello everyone, my name is Pierre Garrault and I am Senior Policy Advisor at Eurosif, the European Sustainable Investment Forum. For this episode of Sustainability Bridges, I am honored to be joined by Mr. Kim Smouter-Umans, Executive Director of the European Network Against Racism, ENAR. Founded in 1998, ENAR is a pan-European anti-racism network that aims to make decisive progress toward racial equality in all EU member states and ultimately to end structural racism and discrimination in the European Union. Prior to joining ENAR, Kim was Head of Public Affairs at ESOMAR, the Global Association for Market, Social and Opinion Research, and was also one of the founding fathers of the ESOMAR Foundation, ESOMAR's charitable arm. Together, we are going to discuss the intersection between diversity, equity and inclusion and climate justice throughout ENAR's wider activities, including the ENAR Foundation's Racial and Economic Justice Investment Fund, as well as Eurosif's Justice, Equity, Diversity and Inclusion workstream. Dear Kim, thank you for joining us today.
Hi Pierre, really nice to meet you today.
To start with, could you please tell about ENAR, its purpose and its areas of work?
Sure, and as you mentioned kind of at the beginning of the introduction, ENAR, the European Network Against Racism, was founded nearly 26 years ago with the mission, in essence, to advance kind of Europe's emerging legislation on anti-discrimination and non-discrimination across Europe. So when ENAR was founded back in the 2000s, essentially Europe had started to adopt for the first time pan-European legislation, which banned discrimination on the basis of race and ethnicity in the field of employment, but also above and beyond in goods and services as well. And ENAR was essentially established to be the civil society stakeholder arm to respond and to monitor and to ensure that that legislative framework actually became a reality. And so since then, we've grown to be a pan-European civil society network of 176 civil society organizations from across Europe, and Europe being the broader European continent. So we're not just focusing on the EU. We also have members in places like the UK, Turkey, so we go beyond the EU sphere. And our mission is really, in one hand, to support these civil society organizations, whether it be both with financial and capacity development kind of activities, but also our key role is to really federate the voices of all of these civil society organizations and ensure that their requests, their demands, their hopes and ambitions for the EU and for Europe is actually translated in policy decisions, in funding, and those types of things. So we're also very much a representative arm there to champion the voices of those which are not often heard at the legislative on the legislative table. So that's kind of our mission and our objectives.
A very important mission indeed. So climate policies have been recently, in recent years, been placed at the center of the European agenda. However, for now, little attention has been given to the concrete effects of climate change on racialized and otherwise marginalized communities. Could you elaborate a bit on how these communities are specifically affected by climate change?
Absolutely. And this is very much the subject of a report which we published last year, which looked very much at indeed that intersection between what we would call racial justice. So very much looking at kind of the lingering and the long-standing damage that structural and systemic racism has on marginalized communities, and how that translates into, in essence, lower educational attainment, lower financial resilience, the inability for individuals to access the labor market or the housing market, so the differing access to goods and services. And so essentially, we looked at kind of how that particular aspect, which is captured in many, many, many different reports, how does that interplay then with the climate justice agenda? And the climate justice agenda being very much also about how do we ensure that we as a society are will become resilient to the climate changes that are going to take place and are going to accelerate in the coming years? And how do we anticipate that as a society? And so our report examined a little bit kind of how this agenda was actually translating on the ground. And what we see, what the report highlights is, for example, the problems that racialized communities in particular are facing, which are climate change related, but also not just. So I will give you some kind of concrete examples of how this actually translates in the ground. And so the report captures, for example, a very well-known case study of the use of pesticides in agriculture. And so, as we know, one part of the green agenda is also to ensure that we start withdrawing the use of these very harmful pesticides, which are having a detrimental effect on insect life, but are also having a detrimental effect on our bodies. And one of the things which we capture in that report is an example where, in fact, pesticides which were banned in metropolitan France for many, many years were actually continue to be used in places where racialized communities are very present. And this is kind of a problem which we highlight where, in fact, the systems are designed to have very different kind of impacts depending on what kind of color scheme you may have. We have also examples of the lower life expectancy of Roma communities. And one of the main reasons why that is because very often the choice of location of certain goods and services, for example, recycling centers or trash incinerators and those type of things, are often placed in places where you have the path where we have least political resistance. And often the least political resistance are places which have been marginalized in the political system. And those marginalized communities in the political system tend to be racialized communities as well. So we see in two very, very mundane examples how, in fact, the two agendas are very much interlinked, and the ability of racialized communities, because they are marginalized to actually face climate changes that are going to come, are very much diminished. And so that's why we become much more interested in how these two policy areas, which are quite far apart, actually are very intricately linked together. And the success of these agendas will also depend on us being aware of those interlinkages and really addressing them head on.
Thank you, Kim. So we have seen in recent months that so this narrative also around climate switches towards focusing more and more on the green transition. So how do we get there? Could you share also how important it is to guarantee that this transition is also just and fair for all different communities?
Yeah, it's absolutely critical that we look at that because, in essence, I see kind of two aspects. First of all, I think it's the green transition is going to require from all of us sacrifices. It's going to require all of us to make significant changes in our lifestyles, in the way we live, the way we move around, the way we heat ourselves, and those types of things. And these are very difficult tasks that we're asking each and every individual citizen to take. For racialized communities in particular, we have to recognize that for many who are from these communities, we're talking about communities which are financially hard done by, communities which are struggling to make ends meet. So their primary focus often tends to be, how do I ensure that by the end of the month, my children are fed, that we still have the heating on, that we have the lights on. And so we're very much looking at communities which are very much still focusing on primary needs. Now, the green transition requires us to really rethink that. And unfortunately, and this is where, in essence, the challenge for us is, when we look at things like organic food, we look at things like, changing a car to an electric vehicle and those types of things. These are big investments. Organic food costs in general 20-25% more than your normal discount food. Buying an electric car has the cost attached to it. So if you're a family which is sharing a vehicle, an old vehicle, because you just can't afford a new vehicle, these kinds of question marks will become the crux as to whether a particular population will accept the challenges which are posed upon us in society because of the green transition, which is a necessary transition. So fairness and justice in that space becomes incredibly important, not just for actually achieving the objectives of the green transition as it's foreseen by politicians, but also in terms of an acceptance of that, so that it's not seen as something that is being imposed by those who have the means on those who do not have the means. And that becomes really important if we're going to actually get acceptance to this. And I'll give you a very concrete example of how this plays out. Here in Brussels, those of you who've been following kind of Brussels and Brussels politics will know that the region's been very much animated by a plan called Good Move. And Good Move is, in essence, an attempt by the Brussels region to change the modal of our modes of transportation within the city, and by favoring the use of cycling, public transportation, in opposition to the vehicle, the car. And in essence, the politicians made a decision to first trial the implementation of Good Move in neighborhoods like Molenbeek, Anderlecht, those types of places, and Schaerbeek, which are parts of the city which are predominantly composed of racialized minorities. And what they felt, and there was consultation in those types of things, but that consultation very much favored those who knew the system, who understand how to be part of the political process and those types of things. So the consultation didn't seem to create much problems. But once it started to be implemented, basically what was happening in different communities is that all of a sudden people saw cement blocks, people were blocked from being able to move in the way that they were used to, and there was absolutely very little consultation with these communities in particular. And so there was a massive rejection of the entire implementation. There was violent protests, signs were being torn down and those types of things. And I think it really demonstrates the importance of the green transition being seen as a transition which accompanies and supports disadvantaged communities, particularly financially disadvantaged communities, so that they see that this is not just an effort that is being imposed upon them and them alone, but it is actually a whole society effort in which they will be accompanied to actually make the choices which are beneficial not just for themselves, but also for society.
And do you see this also as a way to maybe push back a bit on the anti-ESG pushback as well that we've seen in recent years?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's again indeed an important element of that. And that's the more we focus on these issues, the more we accompany people as well, the more we're going to actually have a much bigger buy-in and a much bigger acceptance of the sacrifices we're going to have to make.
Great. And I think this links nicely with the work that you are also conducting with the ENAR Foundation. Could you please tell us a bit about the work of this foundation, and in particular regarding the recently launched Racial and Economic Justice Investment Fund and its objectives?
Absolutely. So indeed, ENAR is a civil society network bringing together all of these organizations. But some years back, around 10 years ago, ENAR also established a foundation, and the first European anti-racism foundation, which was established in essence to provide a kind of fundraising arm for civil society organizations which are working on anti-racism. But since I came into post, one of the things that we've looked at is also how can ENAR Foundation be in essence a vehicle which promotes a more systemically inclusive society. So the idea is very much of this foundation to look at how do we actually make a society which seems to currently be producing systems and structures which systemically exclude people. How do we actually change and reverse that mechanism so that we actually build systems and structures that actually systemically include from its DNA? And that's what the foundation is really interested in. As part of that, we're looking very much at how we can actually demonstrate that happening. So it's really, it's a nice word to say. It's very easy to say, hey, I want a systemically inclusive society. But once you have people who are like, yes, I want to have that too, how do we actually make that happen? How do we actually make that a reality? That's where the difficulty comes. And that's where the foundation is looking at very much initiatives which can demonstrate how we can actually make systems more inclusive. So we're looking at things like how do we reduce the social capital gap that disadvantaged communities have in order to access the professional career ladder. So we're developing pan-European professional networks, which are looking at bringing racialized people from across Europe together to talk about the specific challenges they face, as often the only colored person in their communities. And basically, it's a way for them to get more confident, to share best practice, to share opportunities, to get, in essence, to overcome, in essence, the barriers and the ceilings that they face. We're doing this also in investment funding. So one of the things which I certainly, and I think the foundation, what we're trying to really address is essentially these very long-standing structural and financial gaps that communities have. So because very often our financial growth depends on essentially the wealth that's been accumulated by our ancestors, and that gets passed on down and down the line. And so for us, the investment funding gap is also very palpable. We looked at a little bit at some of the research, which identifies that essentially less than 2% of investing that's taking place currently around the world actually reaches racialized and disadvantaged communities. And so we want to try to address that head on. And so the REGI fund is essentially, so the Racial and Economic Justice Investment Fund is very much looking at that, looking at how do we actually increase the flow coming into racialized communities? How do we ensure that essentially that investment stays within those communities and is also a leverage to improve the financial resilience of these communities from an economic justice perspective, but also from indeed a climate justice perspective. So the REGI Fund is going to be looking for these projects and these initiatives which are led by racialized people, which are looking at how do we make these communities more resilient to the upcoming climate change challenges that are coming our way, and also that are helping to ensure that that investment gets reinvested back into communities. So we're looking at really a very different kind of way of ensuring that that impact investing is really community-driven, community-led, is helping to create systemic changes which are leading to a systemically inclusive society, but at the same time helping our planet by ensuring that these are also initiatives which are looking at how do we accelerate the climate transition and bring along with us communities which have been disadvantaged and hard done by.
And I understand also the ultimate goal is to leverage private investments with that fund.
Yeah, absolutely. So our initial investment is only for us a drop in the pond, and indeed we're hoping to really expand that. And I think the involvement of private investors is going to be critical to ensure that this fund has a long-lasting life. And I think we all can agree that this is something which is really important, that it lasts as long as possible. So for us, we see this also as a way to bridge indeed with private investors, public sector investors, private foundations, whomever wants to be part of that journey. We're very much looking forward to collaborating with them to create a fund which has as much impact as possible, because that's exactly what's needed on the ground.
And more globally, what would be, in your opinion, ways to scale up investment and support from a broader range of financial market participants to bridge the current investing gaps in marginalized community and to support diversity in a wider sense in their invested companies?
Yeah, and that's exactly what the foundation is interested in. So I think REGI for us is a demonstrator, and I think our journey will be very much to demonstrate how something like this can happen in an easier way. So I think taking us, hopefully becoming an inspiration point for other investment funds to essentially adopt very similar modus operandi will be really important. For us, what we also see is that there is, in essence, a need for intentionality here. So I think if we see that only 2% of investing goes into these communities, and then if you look even further down and you look at kind of Black women, it's 0.64%, I think, of investment reaches actually Black women, for example. We need to do better. And I think we can see that with the little amount that actually reaches these communities, a lot gets done. And I think this is where there needs to be a bit more intentionality from investment funding and investment funds to say, well, if we're actually serious about this, we actually need to start investing time, resources in this space, and not as a charitable activity, and not as an activity which is to make us feel good about ourselves, but really because actually these are communities which have become extremely efficient at using every single pound, euro, dollar that comes into these communities. Because there's so little of it, these communities have become extremely resilient and effective at actually making that $1, €1, £1 go as far as possible. So I think for us, it's actually recognizing the investability of these communities, and that there are amazing entrepreneurs there that with very little amounts can actually achieve a lot of impact and a lot of results and a lot of return on investment. So for us, I think it's really collaborating in this. It's really investment funds investing in their own knowledge and their own understanding of what the ENI actually stands, of the benefits that they can bring, and then of adjusting and changing their programs to actually become much more inclusive in that way. And I think for us, it's the entire life cycle, both from the recruitment of potential entrepreneurs all the way to the lifetime, to the support, and at the end of the day, making sure that investment gets reinvested back into the communities that they're actually representing. So for us, there's lots to be done. There's lots of practical steps that can be taken. They're all very possible, easy to do. Well, easy to do perhaps is a question, but at least they're very much, there's a roadmap, and we're hoping through REGI Fund to actually show how that can become a systemic approach that can actually deliver really amazing results for the investment community.
Yeah, and hopefully this offer will also meet the increasing demand for investment funds that focus on social impact, which is what this initiative is all about. So in our own work stream on justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, we also identified some key issues in developing these kinds of investments. And one of the most important is data. Could you elaborate on the perceived challenges that are faced when gathering diversity data, specifically in Europe, and what could be done to improve the current situation?
Yeah, and we're having very much a battle, I guess, in that sense of trying to improve the ability of companies, of organizations to actually collect what we would call equality data. So this is essentially data sets which enable an organization to monitor to what extent their DE and I and B, so diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging programs are actually delivering impact and actually delivering on the promise of trying to unlock, in essence, the career ladders for all people, regardless of their colors of skin, their ethnicity, regardless of whether they're LGBTIQ+, whether they have disabilities and those types of things. So for us, equality data is essential both to provide an understanding as to what is the state of play when it comes to combating racism and discrimination, despite the fact that they've been banned for 20 plus years in Europe, and also to see kind of what the progress is. So we're doing quite a lot of work in this space, particularly we reached out and are collaborating with EFRAG, particularly around the ESRS, kind of the corporate social responsibility and the reporting, to kind of see to what extent can these aspects can be integrated into the reporting that companies have to do. And it's been a battle. It's been a real battle to get organizations to recognize that so much as you're collecting information, for example, on gender, which is something which we all accept that we should be collecting information about whether we have enough women on boards, whether we have enough women in senior leadership roles. It tends to be a very different kind of discussion when it comes to race and ethnicity. All of a sudden, people get very uncomfortable. They're not sure we should be collecting this information. We get reminders of what happened when the Holocaust took place and those types of things. And so you get a lot more resistance for the collection of this information. And so what we've been trying to do as part of the kind of the EFRAG ESRS kind of debate is to actually make the case that actually the collection of equality data is really important also from a non-discrimination perspective. So it enables organizations to understand where they stand and to also, in essence, define kind of what an action plan could look like, which actually addresses the specificities of each organization. And so we've actually tabled a discussion paper in that body, which talks a little bit about, first of all, kind of the Europe's ambitions when it comes to equality and non-discrimination. And there are lots of ambitions. The EU adopted several years ago an action plan against racism, which aims to actually move the lever forward when it comes to non-discrimination on the basis of race and ethnicity. We talk a little bit about the problems and the complexities when it comes to GDPR, because there is a lot of people who have the belief and the mistaken belief that they cannot collect this information because of the General Data Protection Regulation. And so we also discuss about the specificities of GDPR, the exceptions that are in place that enable actually the collection of this information on the basis of legal obligations or indeed for positive reasons. And so we make the case of all of that. We also talk a little bit about the fact that actually the existing legislative framework of the EU requires companies to demonstrate that they are actually in their operations are not leading to a discriminatory outcome. So we have the legal obligation that's in essence infused by the existing non-discrimination framework. And what we're trying to do is kind of bring together all these different points and to demonstrate that actually, if you look at the existing framework, there's a lot of scope for the collection of this information if you really want to understand to what extent your organization is non-discriminatory, to what extent you're actually creating equal opportunities for your employees to actually move up the career ladder, and that you're leveraging your full talent base in the best way possible. So that's why, for us, it's a very important piece of work. We also have, under ENAR, we've been operating for some years now a partnership called Equal at Work, and we're actually working with some leading kind of global brands to talk a little bit about how they actually infuse their D&I programs with equality data as well. So we actually have some really great examples of companies which have been able to collect this kind of information across all the markets, including some of the traditionally known difficult ones like France and Germany, and they've actually been able to do this kind of stuff with employee surveys and that type of stuff, and they're actually a much better place place to say their D&I programs are delivering or the D&I programs are not delivering, but then they know exactly why, and they're able to actually implement actions which really target the specific hurdles or the specific barriers which they would not have otherwise been able to see if it weren't for the fact that they're collecting that information, reporting on it, and using it to improve their programs. So that's for us is really critical. It's a big piece of work, and we're working very closely with companies, with the legislators, with data protection authorities, with survey research companies, with national statistical offices to really start developing an enabling environment for the collection and the use of this kind of data sets.
And what we see from our own network is that there is very much some appetite to identify ways to gather this data, both being respectful of GDPR, but also of national specificities and national sensitivities as well. So this work is extremely important. So as you know, European elections are coming up this June, and how on your end do you think awareness on those different issues could be raised better among EU decision makers, and what could be done at EU level to bridge the gap between public-private investments, but also a just climate transition?
Yeah, absolutely. This is it's for us. It's a concerning time, to be frank, because we're not very sure about what will come out and what will emerge following the elections. As kind of most of the polls are pointing out at the moment, what we're seeing is that they're very much the leaning towards the right, and I would say the far right, seems to be confirming day in, day out. So we're expecting for racialized communities that the post-elections will be a very difficult time for communities which are disadvantaged, which are currently being actively used as scapegoats for all of Europe's ills and wills. So for us, we're very concerned about what will happen as a result of that, that we will probably see a parliament which is a lot less open and a lot less ambitious when it comes to these topics. We will see a commission which will be a lot more reticent to actually addressing these kinds of issues. So we're quite concerned. We're also concerned to what extent this will also translate in terms of the ambitions when it comes to climate change as well. Will we see kind of a retropedaling with regards to some of the really ambitious targets that have been set by this commission and by this parliament? That's to be seen. But at the same time, we're not going to take this lying down. So we've adopted and launched a manifesto, which is essentially bringing together all of our concerns and calls very much for ensuring, in essence, in our case, that the space upon which we can actually champion the values and the rights of disadvantaged groups continues to take place moving forward. And what we're seeing is very much that as the far right starts taking much more space within the regulatory framework, within the legislative framework, we're seeing that the ability of our organizations to champion the needs, the ambitions, and the rights of disadvantaged communities is becoming very much reduced through the use of reduction in funding, the use of administrative tools to prevent these organizations from operating in the first place. We're seeing, so we have one of our members which was actually, which faced a bomb attack, so their offices were actually bombed. So we're seeing, very much, it's a very anxiogene environment that currently exists. And we have to do everything we can in our power to stop this from furthering. And here, I think an alliance between different stakeholders to essentially guarantee the European democratic space is going to become something which we're going to need to mobilize more and more moving forward. And I think here, this is something which is important not just for us as civil society organizations, but indeed for all actors in this space, which is committed to a European Union, which is open, which is free, which is united in diversity, which is ambitious when it comes to the climate transition. And this cannot happen unless we all work hand in hand together. And so for us, that's what the manifesto is all about. For us, that's what these European elections is very much about, is actually, do we continue on a trajectory which enables us to live on a world which we can all live in? And that's the big question mark that I think is facing us. And also, how do we ensure that we stop this very disturbing development where, in essence, migrants and migrant communities and disadvantaged communities and racialized communities which have been here for decades and centuries and millennia are not again becoming the scapegoats as we saw many years ago, which led to the need for the European Union in the first place. And I think if we're not careful, we might sleepwalk into a decade where these things will become a reality again, and we will have not have learned the lessons that we should have learned from the past.
Thanks a lot, Kim, for joining us today and for this very interesting and insightful conversation.
Thank you for having me, Pierre, and looking forward to continuing to collaborate with you in the future.